Hi everybody, this is Liz with Connecting Threads, and today I get to teach you how to sew the classic 9-patch block. Now, this block is classic for a reason. It's been popular for centuries, and it was extremely popular during the Civil War because it could very easily be made out of clothing scraps. Now, it may seem simple, which is great for young and beginner quilters, but as you can see, there are a ton of variations that you can make just by playing around with color and placement. Now, these first top rows here, these are gonna be your very classic, very simple 9-patch. They're gonna be 2 alternating colors, and you can go very bold. So this one right here has a nice black paired with a really light cream. So it's very, very in your face. You can go a little bit more subtle with alternating blue tones, or you can go even more subtle with a very nice color variation of lighter tones on white. So these are a little bit softer, but as you can see, the colors play really beautifully together. Now you don't have to go with this classic formula. You can also play around with color placement. So this one right here has a really nice bold diagonal line down the center, and it creates this really cool teal ombre effect on the diagonal. This creates an entirely different shape with your 9-patch, which I think is a really fun way to play around with color placement. Now this last one here, this was sewn by my coworker Sydney, and I think she did a really great job of taking the 9-patch formula and turning it on its head just a little bit. She took a mini 9-patch and she put it in the corners of her 9-patch, which I thought was really great. Now, once you learn the basic formula of the 9-patch, you can put anything you want in each one of these different square elements and turn a 9-patch into something entirely your own. So there are so many different variations to the 9-patch, which I think is really great, and there are a ton of options. Now in this video, I'm gonna be teaching you how to sew this block right here. It's going to be 2 alternating colors of faux tweed corn silk and faux tweed fern. So let's go ahead and get to the fun part, and let's learn how to sew your classic 9-patch. Let's start by talking about the basic sizing formula. The 9-patch is incredibly simple to figure out because it's just 3 rows of 3 squares each. The block is set on a 3x3 grid, and all of these components, all these squares, are identical, meaning that they will all be the same sewn in size and they will all be cut to the same size. So for this video, we'll be sewing a 12-inch by 12-inch block. The components are very easy to figure out. You take the size of your block, so 12 inches, and you divide it by 3. This tells you the size of each square inside your 9-patch. So for our block, 12 divided by 3 is 4. So that means that each one of these squares, their sewn in size will be 4 by 4 inches. We're going to be making one 9-patch block for this tutorial. And I wanted to mention this because this is a really simple method for making just this one block at one time. There are tons of different methods for making multiple blocks at a time, and we're actually gonna have a video tutorial for you all about that. But for now, it is just going to be about making this one at a time method. Okay, so we have our sizing figured out. Each one of these squares needs to end up at a sewn in size of 4 by 4 inches. Now to cut these, remember, we need to add our seam allowance. So there needs to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance added to each one of the 4 sides of your square. So that means that your finished cut size for all of your squares needs to be 4.5 by 4.5 inches. Cutting is very simple. All you'll need are 5 light squares and 4 dark squares. Remember, you can change the colors however you like, but for this tutorial, we're going to have 5 corn silk squares and we're going to have 4 dark green fern squares. Now let's go ahead and lay them out to prepare for sewing. I'm going to place them in their alternating pattern, and I like to do this because it really helps my brain figure out where everything needs to be sewn. So we'll start with our top row, which will have that dark green in the middle there. Our middle row will have the dark green on the outsides. And then our bottom row will be identical to our top. And we'll have that yellow on the outside and our green on the inside. Now sewing this is going to be very simple. Because this is a non-directional fabric, all I need to do is take my left-hand row right here, and we're just gonna flip it right sides together with our middle row. Now, if you're doing anything that has a more complicated color pattern, you may need to be very particular about this. It's a lot easier when you don't have to worry quite as much about all the different colors here. So we've got our squares together. Now what we're going to do is we're going to pin them and take them over to the sewing machine. And I'm going to teach you how to chain piece all of these together to make your sewing process a lot faster. Chain piecing is really easy when you have a whole bunch of blocks that you need to sew. If you're new to chain piecing, all it means is that we're going to be sewing one block right after the other. But there's a couple of tips and tricks that can help you do it a little bit easier. So let's start by taking our first block. We're going to line it up and we're going to sew using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Don't forget to pull your pins out as you go. Now, right before you get to the end of your block, there's still about a 1/4 inch left. What I like to do is I like to take my next block and I like to line it up pretty close. Now, they're not gonna overlap. You don't have to worry about that. Your block is already pretty well under the presser foot. But this will help as you're chain piecing so that you don't end up having any skipped stitches in between your blocks. So, because this is already pretty close to the end, I don't typically hold this in place. I'll hold this one in place and I will just sew the last little bit of that block. And now my next block is already lined up. We'll go through and we'll cut these apart a little bit later. We'll take our pins out as we go. We'll sew through this one. And just like we did with our last block, before we get to the end of this one, about a 1/4 inch away from the end, we'll take our last block and we'll line it right up. Now, this chain piecing is very, very easy, and you'll get used to the way it flows with your own sewing machine. Take your time to get to know your machine. Chain piecing is really easy, but each machine does it a little bit differently, so it's totally okay if it takes you a little bit to learn your own machine. So we'll go through and we'll finish these up right here with our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once we're done, we'll go ahead and trim our thread. And now all we have to do is take our scissors and trim apart our blocks. So each one of these blocks has a little bit of thread in between, and we'll go ahead and trim those apart. So now we're ready to take these back to our pressing mat. Take your sewn squares and let's go ahead and place them back into the block. We'll get those, and there we go. Now, before I take it over to the pressing mat, I wanted to talk a little bit about how to press your seams. For our top and bottom rows, we'll be pressing our seams inward. So we're gonna have our seams facing the green block. For our middle row, we're going to have our seams facing outward towards the green blocks. What this does is when we sew our rows together, it will help reduce the bulkiness of seams overlapping on each other. It also is a really great way to hide seams behind darker fabrics. So all of our seams, inward and outward, will be facing the dark green squares. That means that nothing will be popping through the lighter of the two fabrics. You can do this any way that you like, but this is a great way, again, to reduce bulk and also to make sure that your seams aren't showing on the right side of the quilt. Let's take our first set of squares. We're going to take it over to our pressing mat, and what I like to do is lay down the lighter of the two because we're going to be pressing this seam that way. Take it right there. I like to open it with my finger just a little bit, take my iron, and remember, this is a pressing tool, so we're gonna press down. You can wiggle just a little bit, but make sure you're not wiggling all over the place because that is how you end up stretching fabric. So if I'm wiggling and moving it all over the place, you can really stretch your fabric out. So we'll go ahead and flip that over, press again, and now we have our first pressed seam. I'm gonna go ahead and press these two, and then we will move on to our next step. Okay, now we're ready to sew our last row right over here. Let's take our right-hand squares, flip them right sides together with our middle squares, and just like we did before, we'll go ahead and pin these seams and then take this over to the sewing machine and chain piece all of these together. Our rows are sewn, and I've gone ahead and pressed according to our top and bottom and middle row pressing tips. So what that means is all of our seams are facing towards the darker of the two fabrics. So for your top and bottom rows, our seams are facing inward towards the green square. For our middle row, our seams are facing outward towards the green squares. We've got all three of our rows sewn. What we need to do is take them and sew them together. Let's start with our top row, flip it right side together with our middle row, and now I need to pin my seams in place. What that means is I'm going to make sure that any seam that is facing towards the sewing machine, so I'm gonna be sewing from this point here all the way down this line. Any of these seam allowances that will be facing the sewing machine need to be pinned down. Don't forget that you need to check the back side as well, because we've got this seam right here that will be facing the sewing machine too. Let's go ahead and take our pins and pin those in place to prep for sewing. We're gonna line up those two seams together to make sure that they're right next to each other. We're gonna take our pin and we're gonna make sure that we are pinning the seam allowance again that's facing the presser foot. We'll do the same for this seam here. Make sure that those two seams line up. Take your pin and pin down the seam allowance that will be facing that presser foot. I also like to go in and pin the front end of my row and the back end of my row. Now we're gonna take this over to the sewing machine and get these rows sewn together. When you're at your sewing machine, take these rows nice and slow. Don't forget that you've got some seam allowances that are gonna be facing the sewing machine, and we've pinned those down, but you wanna make sure that those don't flip up at the machine. So if you're especially newer to this, it takes a little more time to go slow, but it's always nice because you end up having perfect seams. We have our two rows sewn together now, and I wanted to start by pointing out, look at how crisp those corners are. This is another one of the reasons why it's really important for you to pin at your intersections. This ensures that when you flip your rows right side out, those corners are perfectly lined up. We will flip this over and we need to press this seam right here. There are no wrong answers when it comes to pressing this seam. You can press it up, down, but you'll notice there's no way for us to directionally press the seams so that they're only facing the darker fabrics. It's kind of a dealer's choice here. I like to press these seams open. It is entirely up to you. Push that open just a little bit with my finger and press down. Again, just a little bit of a wiggle if you need to. And there we go. Now we need to sew on our final row. It is going to be identical to what you just did. Take that bottom row, flip it right sides together. Now I like to rotate this just a little bit so I can really see what that line towards the sewing machine is going to look like. I'll take my pins, pin my intersections, especially the seam allowances that might be facing the presser foot. And then just like we did with this larger seam, make sure that your open seam here will match this seam as well. So if you're going to press your seam top, bottom, left, right, whatever way you want, make sure that you just do it identically across the other side of your block. This will ensure that as you're sewing, it'll be very simple for you to remember your pressing formula. We're gonna take this over to the sewing machine, sew this and press it, and you will be done with your 9-patch block. And that's it, you've finished your classic 9-patch block. Just by using this basic formula, you can create some really incredible quilts. You can play around with color, tone, and placement to create something that is entirely your own. Now, don't forget to tag us on social media so that we can see all of your 9-patch creations. And we have a ton of tutorials at our YouTube page, and we are continuing to make many, many more. So don't forget to subscribe to the Connecting Threads YouTube page.